welcome to this week's lecture on the topic of attitudes. So I hope for many of you this is going to be a topic that you're already somewhat familiar with. Today we're going to cover some of the basics of just understanding what do we mean by the term attitude. So from a social cognition perspective, what are we referring to? We're going to focus then in the rest of the lecture on some of the more kind of applied context of how do we get attitudes to change, and then how does the context influence the attitudes that we hold. So if we start off just by thinking about what exactly do we mean by the term attitude. For many people, like in your daily language, so if you see the word attitude that gets used in movies, films, etc., you might often hear someone say, oh, that person's got an attitude, and it will often refer to their sort of disposition, so the way that this person might respond consistently negatively to events. So you say someone's got an attitude, and you imply that they respond in a bad way, that they're kind of moody, a little testy, etc. So we can describe people as having an attitude, but in a sort of research and social cognition perspective, when we talk about attitudes, what we're referring to here is a person's evaluation of a target object or some target subject matter that's there. And this target that we're talking about can be pretty much anything. So it can be your attitude towards something that is relatively abstract and esoteric. So one thing we could have an attitude towards is liberalism. So your kind of political philosophy or worldview founded on the ideas of liberty and equality. So that's something that's relatively abstract. Another abstract example would be your attitude towards feminism. At the same time, we can then have much more specific and concrete targets. So a very simple one would be, what is your attitude towards chocolate or Brussels sprouts or coffee, towards a specific politician, or towards a particular band. So this is one of my favourite bands over the last couple of decades. So again, the key thing here is that these attitudes that we have, they've got to have a subject matter. It could be an object, a person, an abstract idea. And that means that when we talk about attitudes, they've got relevance across a huge range of domains. So they'll be relevant in domains such as marketing. So this is going to be our attitude towards products. It's got relevance in advertising, so our attitude towards particular brands. Political behaviour, so our attitudes towards specific candidates, parties, voting. We then have attitudes that are relevant in the health domain, so attitudes towards engaging in health protective behaviours, new medications. Attitudes towards vaccination is probably something that couldn't be any more important right now. And then you also have these attitudes that we have towards other people. Often it's described or falls under this category of interpersonal liking. We have attitudes that you can hold towards the self that fall under a domain of self-esteem. And then attitudes towards these more abstract ideas can often be referred to as values. But the core thing is, what we're representing here is some evaluative response towards an object that is then generally expressed in the way that we think and act, to how we then behave and interact with that subject or target. It's also the case that attitudes are activated when this target concept comes to mind. So the idea that we're not sort of constantly holding all of these attitudes activated, it's only when we think of the subject matter that then our evaluative response towards this target becomes activated, and these attitudes require some sort of dimension of judgment. So you can almost think of this as the way that you might think of like a Likert scale response. So it's got to go from bad to good, or it could go from like to dislike. Alternatively, it could go from something that you think is cool to the polar opposite of that would be something that it is lame or uncool. So you would have to have this dimension where you're judging it that goes along sort of a continuum. But generally, one of the ways that I think is simplest to think of this is our evaluations are going to be from being positive evaluation, positive attitude towards something, versus a negative evaluation or negative attitude. Now, just how stable are these attitudes? And it turns out that this isn't an easy question to answer, and there's a lot of controversy over the stability of attitudes. I'm going to make the assumption throughout most of this lecture when I refer to attitudes is that we're talking about something that is relatively stable and enduring. So on the figure that's here, what we've got is a few different quotes that are taken to illustrate researchers' different perspectives on how they think attitudes are represented in terms of their stability. So on the left-hand side, Rich Petty, Bruno, and Di Marie define attitude objects linked in memory to global evaluative associations. So in other words, for them, they kind of ascribe to this sort of file drawer concept where if we're trying to access our attitude towards something, we would have stored away some representation in long-term memory of what is our attitude, what is our evaluation towards this target object, and then when we want to access that evaluative information, it's essentially like we kind of go into that file drawer and we find that permanently stored evaluation knowledge there. Whereas others suggest that maybe we actually create these attitudes a little bit more on the fly as needed. So it's the idea that we don't have any kind of permanent stored attitude in long-term memory. Rather, we just, based on the current context and situation, we end up creating sort of evaluation or an attitude. And there's evidence that sometimes that might be the case. And one of the things that might moderate this, for example, is the degree of attitude strength. So there's probably some attitudes that are really going to be invariable and don't change over time very much, whereas attitudes that don't have much strength, yeah, they might be much more liable to kind of make up and construct on the spot. So an example of a domain where your attitudes might be very strong is in the area of politics. So for many people over their lifetime, their political attitudes after they formed at a relatively young age, so by the time maybe sort of 17, 18, these are very unlikely to change over your lifetime or over time. Again, I'm not saying it doesn't change for anybody, but there's a relatively strong degree of stability there. So in the UK, for example, most people have a strong affinity for the principles of a particular political party, so that might be Labour or Conservative, some people Liberal Democrats, the Green Party, and often people don't shift their preferences too much over time, and if they do so, it doesn't happen quickly. However, on the other hand, some of our other attitudes might actually be a bit less stable than we first think. So a lot of this evidence comes from the fact that the context, so aspects of the situation, the environment or particular temporary states that we're in, they can have an impact on our attitudes. So the first one of these is our current mood state. So whether we're in a good or a bad mood can have a direct effect on our attitude towards other objects that are there in the environment. So a simple example of this might be if you imagine that you're getting onto the BTS and it's absolutely packed. If you're in a really good mood, I imagine that you've had a great day. That might change the way that you end up perceiving that situation. You really embrace the kind of cramped conditions. You see it as something positive. It's an indicator of kind of everyone living communally together. We're all traveling as this kind of cohesive unit, busily heading off for a fun time. Whereas if you're in a kind of negative mood, maybe you've had a really bad day, your attitude towards the crowd might be very different, and the act of someone just maybe accidentally nudging you, that's going to be enough to kind of make you annoyed and irritated. It's also the case that our attitudes can change depending on who it is that you're talking to. So you can probably each think of people to whom the attitudes that you end up expressing will differ, so whether they're kind of tempered down or the things that you end up prioritizing. So with some friends, you might prioritize certain attitudes over others. So for example, your attitudes towards academic work, that's going to differ depending on if you're hanging around friends that are doing kind of summer school, and these are people that are kind of committed to hard work, versus if you imagine you're hanging around friends who don't really value academic achievement. This might have a small influence on the way that you end up expressing those attitudes towards academic work. Finally, there's also the argument that in many situations we actually end up kind of misrecalling or making up our attitudes based on our behaviour. So if you're familiar with self-perception theory that was put forward by Darrell Bem, this is generally kind of based on sort of dissonance theories, with the idea that we want our behaviour and our cognitions to be consistent with each other. Darrell Bem's self-perception theory basically put this argument forwards that reverses this traditional role of how attitudes and behaviours go together. So if you think of the common sense way and how we'll approach it throughout most of this lecture, is the idea that we have these attitudes that come first, and then whatever your attitude is, whether it's positive or negative, this leads you to behave in a way that's consistent with this. So in other words, if I'm registered politically as a kind of Democrat, I have a positive attitude towards Democrats and negative attitude towards Republicans, then when I go to vote, I'm going to be more likely to vote for a Democrat than I am for a Republican. Bem's argument was actually it's the other way round almost, that our behaviour is what then informs our attitudes. So he would argue that we would go and observe our behaviour, so we would observe ourselves voting for Republicans or Democrats, and then based on this behaviour that we engage in, we'd then make an inference about what kind of person am I, what attitude do I have towards the Democrats and the Republican Party here. The political example here might be probably a little bit extreme, that maybe it's easier to think of this when you're using less strong attitudes. So one of the ways that they demonstrated this, that again you should be familiar with, is the kind of classic foot in the door effect. So the findings where, so this was Friedman and Fraser in the 1960s, would go around and ask individuals at home to do a small behaviour. In this case it was signing a safe driving campaign, and they would then later turn up at people's houses of people who hadn't been asked to sign these forms, and ask them to do something that was a little bit more demanding. So it would ask them to put up this poster, and it was a relatively unattractive poster, in the front lawn of their house, promoting safe driving. And the foot in the door effect there was based this argument that those who had previously signed the safe driving were much more likely to agree to put up the poster into their garden. And this essentially is the idea that that behaviour, an act of signing, then makes people come up with the attitude, or infer this attitude, that I am a pro-safe driving individual, and that's what then drives your greater level of acceptance later on when you're asked to put this sort of unattractive sign into your garden. So we also know that people have sort of implicit theories or implicit understanding about what attributes or what targets their attitudes are liable to actually change over time. So for example, if I was to ask you your favourite TV programme right now, do you think that your attitude towards this is going to change over time as you get older? Your attitude towards games that you play right now. So when you play Pokemon, if I ask you in 30 years time, do you think you're going to love Pokemon or a particular TV series as much as you do right now? Many people would turn around and go, no, I think my attitudes and my preferences would change over time. You wouldn't expect to be playing Pokemon in your 50s. Whereas there are other attitudes that you kind of just have this implicit understanding that, yeah, that is my belief in the idea of freedom, liberalism, equality, and I don't expect that is going to change over time. I wouldn't expect when I get into my 50s that I'm suddenly going to believe in inequality or different political viewpoints. So we have this implicit understanding that some things will and some things won't change. So in terms of where do we form these attitudes, most of the attitudes that we get develop through experience. So this through our childhood, adulthood, etc. So a very simple example would be my attitude towards water parks is driven through the past experience, the trips that you take to a water park. If I find that it's a fun experience, I'm going to have a positive attitude towards water parks. That's pretty straightforward. So classical conditioning, operant conditioning, just repeated exposure can also be enough to form a positive attitude. So again, I'm sure you're familiar with the mere exposure effect. So there's ideas that we tend to like things that we're consistently exposed to. That's the one of the central functions of advertising, is just presenting an object over and over again. I get familiar with it. We tend to like and have a more positive attitude towards these things. So that's one way, just experience is going to drive this. But I think it's also to point out that there are genetic components that can drive our preferences. So probably the most fundamental level, we can have differences in our motivational drives in terms of how keen we are to approach rewards, so how keen you are to take risks, to be outgoing, versus how keen you are to avoid threats and avoid punishment. So this would have a pretty strong influence on the kinds of things that you're like. So if you're a very approach-moded, extroverted individual, you're probably going to enjoy things that involve risk-taking. So you might enjoy paragliding, going down water slides, etc. Whereas if you're much more risk-averse, maybe the things that you have positive attitudes are the much more introverted things, going to the cinema, sitting at home reading a book, etc. There's also much more kind of directly genetic related things, such as your attitude towards something such as coriander or cilantro. There is an actual gene that can influence the way that you end up perceiving the taste of coriander. So I think between 4 and 14% of the population have this gene where coriander to them just tastes like soap. So it's a gene OR6A2, which even has a website of this cilantro club. So I think if you go on, it always used to be ihatecilantro.com, I'm not sure if it's there. But these are some words that people would use to describe their experience of cilantro. And then clearly you're going to have huge differences that occur. That if you've got this genetically influenced change in the way that you taste it, you're going to have a pretty automatic dislike. Unless you're keen on, maybe you do like eating detergent. Okay, let's return to an idea that I talked about a couple of slides ago of attitude strength. So this is how enduring or stable is the attitude that we hold. Is it strong or is it maybe a little bit weaker? And it turns out that there's a kind of more formal way of classifying or different criteria that contribute towards how strong an attitude is. So for you, if you think of an attitude that you hold, and then you can ask yourself a range of different questions just to tap into what is the strength of that attitude. And to do this, I'm going to give you an example of somebody who has an attitude towards animal conservation. So we can think of, first of all, the accessibility here. So for this individual, if they encounter an article that talks about something such as poaching, for it to be accessible, they would automatically have this attitude, this evaluation come into mind that animal conservation is really important to me. That would immediately sort of pop up. So it'd have to be easily accessible. It wouldn't be the case of you needing to kind of explicitly think and scratch your head over, yeah, well, what is my attitude towards this? It would just pop into your mind. Then we have the issue of ambivalence. So do you have a mixture of positive and negative thoughts towards it? And for somebody with a strong animal conservation attitude, they would just have a strong sort of negative attitude towards poaching and a positive attitude towards conservation. Certainty, are you sure of it? Do you have any doubts? Ego involvement. So for some people, their attitude towards animal conservation will be part of their broader self-schema. So one of the ways that they identify is that I'm sort of animal rights campaigner, etc. And then you have issues of extremity. So how strongly do you feel about this, or is it just an attitude that you hold on a kind of temporary whim at the moment? And then for example, your knowledge base. So that kind of goes with issue involvement as well, of how important is this to you. And then your knowledge base is your belief in animal conservation based on a high degree of actual knowledge, that you've done lots of reading about this, and the more so it is, the stronger that attitude is going to be. So all of those factors there's no exact science in this, but all of those factors are going to combine to determine the strength of the attitude that somebody holds. Now, if we look at the structure of how on earth are these attitudes actually stored and represented, I think one of the easiest ways to think of this is, first of all, that when we've talked about the concept of schemas, you can think of the evaluation that you have as this referent, or this target, is represented at the center, so it's the central element, and then all around this schema we have different pieces of information, so some of which are not necessarily evaluative, some are just semantic information and knowledge about that reference, but some features are evaluative. And it's these evaluative features that are going to contribute towards your attitude towards that referent. So you can think of this again like an associative network model of attitudes. So if we look at, this is one that I plucked off of somebody's slides online, and I think it does a decent job of representing a theoretical associative network for the golfer Tiger Woods. So again, this is something we never really have kind of direct insight into what is someone's genuine associative network. What we're building up here is presumed nodes that would go into a reasonable associative network. One of the ways that you might see this is if you looked at people's reaction times through kind of priming tasks. The quicker somebody was able to respond, you could get a kind of indication of what their associative network looks like. But let's assume on here that we're just making reasonable assumptions of what an associative network would look like, and then the strength of different connections is indicated by the thickness of those lines. So when you think of Tiger Woods, the first thing that would come to mind, the thing that's strongest associated with the concept of Tiger Woods, is the idea that he's a professional golfer. And then activating that node of a professional golfer, that would then activate other golfers such as Phil Mickelson, Vijay Singh, etc. The other things that you directly activate are all of these semantic informations about him. So, he's male, he's American. We activate attributes that he possesses. So we know that he's dedicated, he's skilled, he's confident. And then we activate elements that have a much more evaluative nature to it. So you know that he's likable. And then you could include in there just a very simple evaluative concept that doesn't feature on here, that how much you positively value him. And I like, there's a little side note in the editor's note on here. This figure was submitted for publication prior to highly publicised events that may alter the associations that some readers have of Tiger Woods. So I think this was before it found out that he was having a series of affairs that, would probably shift or adjust some of those associations. So essentially what we're doing here when we're building up an associative network that includes attitudes is that when we see the presentation of our object or our target, in this case it could be either Tiger Woods or something like a small cat, we would activate the node for kitten, whilst at the same time you would co-activate the concept of cute. And it's just through repeated pairing of those different associations together that you would then start to draw a connection and a link. And the more times that connection is paired, the stronger that association or that link would be, until you end up building up this kind of much bigger associative network here. And then what we have is that over time, when you've got these connections between different nodes, when they strengthen enough, the activations one is going to automatically activate the other node. So in other words, every time that I activate the node for kitten, this automatic evaluation that I have that kittens are cute, positive, etc. Will become automatically activated. And this brings us on to an important distinction that can be made between explicit and implicit attitudes that we hold. So again, this is probably a term that you should be familiar with, but implicit attitudes are essentially going to reflect just this pure automatic associations that occur between different concepts, so between different nodes within our associative networks there. So these are just the automatic associations that occur. When one node, such as a kitten, gets activated, how does that then influence the activation of the evaluative concept of cute, etc. And then at another level, we have these explicit attitudes. So when I ask you, how do you think kittens are, you would probably to some degree end up consulting that implicit automatic association between kittens and cuteness. But you then also exert some sort of top-down control and reasoning when you're trying to deliver that explanation. So when you're trying to articulate and say to somebody, yeah, I think kittens are cute. There's a number of factors that you might take into account there as well, like the context that you're in, etc. So we can sort of see how these two implicit and explicit attitudes are related to each other. So underneath the hood, the implicit attitudes are just these automatic associations, and then we have some more controlled processing, some logical reasoning processes that will influence the explicit attitudes that we end up reporting to ourselves and to other people. So one of the kind of classic ways that you can tap into or try to understand someone's implicit attitude is using the implicit association test. So this is measuring attitudes and beliefs that maybe people are kind of unwilling or unable to introspect or report. So how do we understand what people's implicit attitudes or what are their kind of underlying automatic associations that people hold? And one of the ways you can do this is using something known as the implicit association test. So we're going to go into this in a lot more detail later in the course, but the basic premises of it is that it works on detecting differences in your reaction time as you end up sorting target members from a particular category when you sort them into piles that belong to concepts associated with good or bad. So one of the ways that this might work is, suppose if you want to investigate what is someone's attitude towards old people. So what I would do is I then present words one at a time on a computer screen, and some of these words are going to describe old people, some of the words are going to describe young people. Then some of the words that are presented are good, some of the words are bad. And your job as a participant is to sort these words into one of two piles. And in one condition, I would end up telling you that you've got to sort everything that is either young or good would go into the left-hand pile, so you'd have to press a key on the left-hand side, and everything that is old and bad has to go into the right-hand side. And then you would do that, so you keep sorting, shuffling these through, and then you do another version where instead, this time you have to pair things that are young and bad go together on the left hand side, and things that are old and good go together on the right hand side. And here this relies on the inference that if a person actually has a negative attitude towards old people, then the person is going to respond faster when you've got to categorize or pair things that are old and bad together, as opposed to when you've got to respond to things that are old and good together. So then what you can do is compare the response times for these compatible and the incompatible sets of words, and look at what was the kind of relative strength of pairing good with old as opposed to good with bad. And this can give us a sort of index of somebody's implicit attitude. Don't worry if that doesn't make any sense. You're going to take part in the IAT and do some examples of this in much more detail in the following week's class. So the IAT is one way that we can assess and measure these automatic associations between target concepts and evaluations. But we're also interested in people's explicit attitudes. So how is it that they report and say that they feel and evaluate different target concepts? And if we want to understand these explicit attitudes, what are the ways that we go and do this? So one of the most common ways that you should be very familiar with is through self-report measures. This is typically where you would give someone multiple different items, multiple different questions about a particular concept and ask them how they feel about it. And we can use this to get an insight into their explicit attitude. So the items on here, for example, tap into different attitudes that somebody would have towards robots. So whether they would feel uneasy if robots really had emotions, they think something bad might happen if robots developed into living beings. I would feel relaxed talking with robots. And the more positive the responses you give in there, the more positive your attitude would be towards robots. And it makes one of the core assumptions of this self-report is the fact that people are actually willing and able to report on the attitudes that they experience. The problem with this is not always the case. So there's sometimes when people are either unwilling, so you might hide your true attitudes towards something in order to present yourself in a bit more of a positive light. This is oftenly referred to as socially desirable responding. So this is probably often the case on asking people attitudes towards very sensitive topics. So it might be the case if somebody genuinely deep down had slightly kind of racial prejudices, and I asked you what are your attitudes towards people of a different race. It might be the case that I know that my racist attitudes are inappropriate, they're not socially acceptable. I might just be unwilling to openly admit this and to state it. Another issue is maybe sometimes people are just unable. So it might be the case that I have very mixed, ambivalent attitudes towards a particular target. When you're asking me to think about what is my attitude towards them, I can't really accurately pin down what my attitude or how I would behave in particular situations with this target person. So it might be unwilling or unable. So while self-reports are often the kind of go-to approach, there are alternatives to the self-report measures. So one of these is we can adopt psychophysiological measures. So if I want to know what is somebody's attitude towards, so I've got maybe a bunch of white undergraduate students, the classic psychology demographic. Say I want to know what is their attitude towards African Americans. One of the things I could do is measure physiological indicators of a stress response or an anxiety response whilst I presented faces or stimuli representing African Americans. So if I measured their skin conductance level, so that's an indicator of the galvanic, it is the galvanic skin response, but it's an indicator of the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which generally occurs when you experience anxiety or sort of fight or flight response. So I could measure and know that if there's an increase in somebody's skin conductance, that's indicating that they are sort of stressed and probably have a negative attitude or a negative evaluation of members of whatever category I'm presenting them photos of on the screen. Similarly, you could do fMRI studies where maybe you look at activation in regions associated with stress, threat, fear processing. So you might look at activation in the amygdala, and again, that would be an indicator of these people, these white undergraduates, clearly have a negative attitude towards the African Americans that they're being presented the photos of. We can also take slightly more creative approaches to look at archival data from individuals. So rather than trying to assess people's attitudes in the current time or getting them to retrospectively think about your attitudes in the past, we can look at information that gives us insight into their attitudes at a particular time and see how that then predicts longitudinal outcomes. So one study that I really liked that I've referenced here from Danner et al. Wanted to ask the research question of how does having a positive attitude impact the longevity of your life. So in other words, is it the case that people that have a positive attitude towards life, do they live longer? And this is a bit of a challenging one if you want to understand what were people's positive attitudes towards life when they were younger. So they did this in a sample of nuns, and one way that you could do this is to ask the nuns as they're old, how did you feel when you were younger? Did you have a positive disposition or a positive outlook? And the problem with that is that there's a lot of potential for response bias. So there's a lot of things that have happened during the middle of their life and later life that's probably going to influence their responses. So it's not really a very accurate way. So one of the ways that you could do this instead is just look at the text analysis of their diaries when they were younger and see what is it in the way that they talk about the world, how do they describe their interactions with other people, do they describe it in like positive or negative terms. So they did this with the handwritten diaries of 180 Catholic nuns. These were done when the nuns were kind of like average age of sort of low 20s. And then they would match up what was the emotional content of these diaries to their survival rates of the nuns when they were like aged 75 to 90. And you get this strong inverse association between positive emotional content and the risk of mortality. So in other words, the more positive emotional content that was in the diaries, the less likely they were to have died by this point. So that's a really nice way that you could kind of use a creative approach to understand people's attitudes without explicitly asking them what their attitude is. We can also use behavioral studies, so either experiments or field studies to look at people's attitudes. So these behavioral studies are particularly useful when we're trying to understand people's attitudes in a context where they're probably unlikely to openly admit any negative attitudes that they have towards a certain demographic. So again, the typical example there would be if you possess a negative attitude towards Arab Muslims or African Americans. This is something that you would probably want to conceal in most explicit self-report measures of your attitudes. So instead we can use an experimental study that would manipulate key bits of information and then see how do you respond and then make an inference about somebody's attitude. So one classic way that this would be done, and it's done in multiple different studies, is where you might present the same job application and the one thing that you manipulate on there is the person's name. So whether you present a very European sounding name or a Arab Muslim Arabic sounding name that's on there. And then you can look at how do people evaluate these different job applications. And if the only thing that is varying is the applicant's name and your interpretation of where they come from, what is the kind of background, then you can make an inference that if people are rating the Arabic name as a kind of poorer, lower quality application, you can make a pretty reasonable inference that somebody has a negative attitude towards Arab Muslims. Similarly, there's a range of other studies that look at indirect non-verbal behavior. So you might set up a study where if I wanted to examine someone's attitude towards African Americans, you could have somebody who's African American that's sitting in a waiting room, and you would measure what is the proximity with which somebody who comes into the waiting room sits next to the African American, or it could be a disabled person, whatever your target demographic is. And this proximity would be a kind of indirect indicator of the person's attitude. And again, these sort of measures are not perfect, but when you combine multiple different approaches, we can start to get a kind of insight into what people's attitudes are. So another creative approach that I don't think is necessarily used that much nowadays, but involves some degree of deception, is a technique known as the bogus pipeline. This is basically like a fake lie detector. So it's a fake polygraph that you set up with the goal of getting participants to respond truthfully to the questions that you're giving them. So you tell the participant that comes in that you're being monitored by a machine. So basically you're hooked up to this lie detector, and you would put little pads that would ostensibly tell them that we're measuring your skin conductance, etc. With the idea that if they believe that false responses are clearly going to be detected, then they're more likely to be honest and actually tell the truth. Now again, all of these things that are hooked up and connected are fake. You're not giving them any genuine feedback on here. Now, one example of the use of the bogus pipeline and how it can reduce sort of social desirability in responding, I think is quite nicely illustrated in some research by Fisher. So in this study, they had a large sample of male and female students. 293 of them would come in, and they were asked to fill out this survey on indicating the number of previous sexual partners that you've had. So this is a kind of question that has a lot of social desirability associated with it that differs depending on your sex. So typically for men, there's no shame in having a kind of long string or a large list of previous sexual partners, whereas there might be in society, there might be perceived to be a little bit more shame associated if women have a high list of sexual partners. And again, I'm not saying that should be the case, I'm just saying that is what tends to occur in a lot of contemporary society still. And they want to see here, what is the difference in the response rate of individuals when you get them to complete a survey in an anonymous condition versus the bogus pipeline condition. So they had participants come in, and this is a between subject design. So in one version, you're coming in, you're hooked up to these wires, and you're told, this machine is going to tell if you're lying, give us the true answer. In another version, they're also hooked up to some wires, and they're just told, this machine is going to measure your anxiety level whilst you're doing it. And they do that because they want these two conditions to be as similar as possible, with the only difference being that in one of them you think the machine is going to know if you're lying. And you get a really nice sort of contrast in the response that under the anonymous conditions, both the males and the females report a relatively similar number, whereas when you're kind of freed of the sort of feeling that you should be giving a socially respectable response, the males actually reduce, so their honest response is lower than in the anonymous condition, and for females the number of sexual partners increases.